Episode 3. So, in our first couple of episodes, we talked about the questions we might want to start asking about society and about the nations that those societies are built within. Now, those two were pretty short and pretty easy videos for me to explain, and this one is going to be a little bit harder, so you're going to have to bear with me, because the concept I want to talk about today is much bigger, I think, in a weird way. Less cohesive. That's the way we're going to put it. And that is of neoliberalist society, or neoliberalism. Now, if you're sat there wondering, what on earth is that? That sounds like a disease. Maybe you're not too wrong. But neoliberalism is a very, very broad term that we use to describe a capitalist society that focuses on individualist goals. So we have talked before today about individualism versus collectivism, the idea of myself versus we. Neoliberalism is kind of what happens when you make individualism the focus of a society. Now, that sounds really dark, and you are probably sat there thinking, I mean, I don't think that's right. I live in a society that does care about people. We have things that do that, like, the NHS. And you'd be right. We do have a society that is not quite so obsessed with the individual, but I think we need to talk about that. There is a quote floating around the internet that I originally thought was attributed to Mark Twain. Then I was told it was actually Oscar Wilde, and the internet now disagrees with both of those origin points. And the quote is thus: "It is much easier to lie to someone than it is to convince them that they have been lied to." Seems simple enough. It's easier for me to lie to you than it is for me to convince you that your trusted friend has lied to you. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. We as humans are social creatures, and we inherently trust information we're given. This is why bias is such a focus of studies like critical thinking. Media bias is a huge problem in our society that we probably should do another video on at some point. Maybe when I have a better microphone. But as a whole, humans trust information inherently, and the reason for this is it goes back to the social creatures thing. You imagine that a group of humans are gathering, and the human who is on watch shouts, "Danger!" in, Neolithic man. All the other humans trust that because it is a more guaranteed way to survive. They trust the person on watch. They say, hey, they're not saying, well, why are you saying that? What interest do you have in saying that a saber-tooth is coming to eat us, huh? What's the gig here? Because if you're wrong, the saber-tooth is going to eat you. It doesn't make any sense. That is why we tend to inherently trust information. It's a massive oversimplification, but it's that principle. So when we are lied to, especially over a consistent period of time, it becomes much harder to unseat that deception from our minds because it is the status quo of our outlook. Remember, we talked about humans being creatures of the status quo. So what I'm going to attempt to do under that understanding feels very foolish. But that's what we do here. So, neoliberalism, what is it? Well, it is a societal outlook, and that is underpinned by two key pillars, and we're only really going to talk about one of those today. The first, and the one we're going to ignore, is monetarist economics. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. It's a school of thought of economics, and if you want to look it up, I wanted to put the name in here so that you can understand it. What we're going to talk about today is individualism as a concept in a broader society. That's much easier to talk about, funnily enough. So, the core tenet of neoliberalism is that if you work hard enough at something, you will achieve it. That could be a goal of, owning a house, or buying a flash car, owning a second home, having enough money to look after yourself when you're old. And we're told that that goal is achievable if only you study hard, you go to university, you get a good job at a good firm, and you turn up every day and you work. Graft, son, and you'll earn. But is that entirely true? Well, yes and no. All good lies have as much truth in them as possible. And we all know somebody for whom that worked. Perhaps somebody who started out work, on the shop floor and became the manager of the business, or somebody who had a great startup idea and is now living in the Cotswolds in a house covered in duck egg blue. And they're real world examples of people. And often those people that we meet that, really played the game well and climbed the ladder aren't bad people. Often when you say, well, what do you do with your money? Well, a lot of it goes to looking after my mom, and a lot of it goes to make sure that my kids are all right. They are morally not corrupt their morally good principles and good motivations to climb that ladder. But the ladder is a lottery more than a ladder, because for every one person that system works for every person who played the game well, are dozens of others they inadvertently, in many cases, climbed over to get there. This is what we're talking about when we're trying to discuss the idea of a culture of me, a society based around myself, that I can succeed, but it must be at the expense of others. Now that is the bit that is less readily sold to you in the PR machine of neoliberalism, because that's something that people don't like doing. We don't really like the idea, by and large, there are exceptions, of my success at the expense of my neighbours. But that's exactly what it is, because we have a top-down society. You have several high-end jobs, if you will, in any organisation, if it's company, country or charity, and below them, that triangle widens out. So if you want to get from here to here, you've got to climb over people to do it. There are people who will not get that job that you get, who may have been as deserving of it, if not more. But individualism. I must look after my own and my family, because nobody else will. That's the truth of the world. Does it have to be? We talked about how nations try to maximise welfare, in theory, and why there are huge inhibitors to that in the fabric of nations. And neoliberalism is kind of a way that often countries use to hold back on doing some of those things. There isn't enough money in the pot, for example, for everyone to have, healthcare paid for by the state. Even if that's a need of society, it's ignored because there's a logical reason. But it's okay. Don't panic. If you work hard enough, you can get a job that provides health insurance and you'll be fine. And don't worry about those 100 people who were in that lower management job with you or working in that supermarket with you who didn't get it, because you did, right? And at the end of the day, that's all you can expect, to look after you and yours. This is why it's a very insidious societal structure. It presupposes the idea that I must succeed at his expense, and that in not succeeding, really bad things can happen to that other person. Because if you go pure neoliberalist society with no hang-ups of an older, more collectivist age like the National Health Service or the welfare state, then you get a society much more like the United States, which, as we discussed in previous videos, is currently collapsing under the debate of whether or not they should treat people who are suffering from a pandemic for free. Now, the United States is an extreme example of neoliberalism. The UK is more on the borders of what lots of Western countries have. And even we are seeing a change in our culture, our society, towards individualism. We talked about panic buying in the previous episode, and this is what happens when a society has the attitude of a panic buyer, which is damn scary. That's the first tenet of neoliberalism. Individualism and individual success at the cost of others. So, we've talked about the working hard to succeed part of neoliberalism and the individual at the expense of the collective part of neoliberalism. And that's an interesting theory, right? That's something that, as intelligent people to sit and ponder, is worth doing. But how does that actually look as a country, as a organisation? Well, one of the other obscure aspects of neoliberalism is that because of that first tenet, the idea that we have to work hard to get somewhere, we think that if somebody's got somewhere, they've had to work hard. And that isn't true. That working hard to get somewhere, meaning that if they're somewhere they've worked hard, results in this attitude that, if somebody's in charge, then they are the right person for the job. Under capitalism, competition and all that, the person who is best equipped to manage an organisation, a shop, whatever, will get that role. And that's good because they've worked hard to get there, so they deserve to be there. So why do companies fail then? Huge companies like Carillion, for example, who last year collapsed in the UK due to corporate incompetence. Surely if the best person for that job was in that job and they were surrounded equally by the best people, that collapse never would have occurred. Or the 2008 financial crash, Why would that happen? If the best people were in the best jobs, how did nobody see that coming to stop it? But what about a pandemic? I mean, it's not like we could have seen this coming or had, 6 weeks watching other countries handle it before it got here. And if the best people are in those jobs, then surely then we'll be fine. We'll handle it, right? So why didn't our Prime Minister attend 6 Cobra meetings That's the Emergency UK Security Council before this pandemic hit in earnest in this country. That doesn't sound like somebody who's there because they're the best for the job to me. But that tendency, that belief that if you're here, then you worked hard to get here, means that people will defend, ordinary people will defend people who occupy those very, very high positions of power, because if they don't, if they say, no, you shouldn't be there, you're not competent enough, it means that they can't get there based on merit alone. And that admission, looking that lie in the face, they can't do it, because everything relies on that idea that if you work hard, you'll get there. So if somebody got there without working hard, that throws the whole thing into question. Which I think is one of the smarter aspects of neoliberal society, and why it requires such a strong state, such a strong status quo to maintain it. So if looking that lie in the face, if accepting that maybe I can't get there based on merit, is such a galling prospect to so many people, and rightfully so, it's terrifying. The idea that this principle that's underpinned most of your life, or all of it, is a lie. If the idea that working hard to get there isn't quite possible, is there another societal outlook that would allow you to? Or if you can't get here, maybe it will allow you some of those aspects of welfare, that house that you wanted to buy, that healthcare that you wanted to provide for your aging relatives, that healthcare you might want to give to the victims of a pandemic. Maybe there is something that would provide that. And that's going to be the subject of a later video. But that's pretty much it. That's neoliberalism. And it's... I hope I've done a reasonable job of explaining it. I'm not sure I have, if I'm honest. It's an incredibly long and convoluted subject that is so different when you look at it from country to country to country. I could spend, an hour and a half talking about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and their implementation of it. But I honestly don't think that would go down too well, if I'm honest. I think that people would switch off. So this is the introduction to neoliberalism, and if people want a larger explanation at a later date, maybe we can go down that route. Anyway, I hope this finds you well. The weather is still really nice here, and I'm definitely not just filming this, day after day after day. And wherever you are in the world, stay safe.